Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
South Africa is hosting G20 foreign ministers in Johannesburg, but can its call for solidarity, equality, and sustainability stand up against an increasingly divided world order?
Geopolitical tensions and rising intolerance, conflict and war, climate change, pandemics, and energy and food insecurity do threaten an already fragile global coexistence.
With the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio refusing to attend and the Trump administration using this time to bring Russia out of the diplomatic cold, what can the first big meeting of South Africa's G20 presidency actually achieve?
We're gathered here in the hall named Under the Tree. In African folklore and communities, we gather under a tree to have difficult conversations that challenges us. I hope that this hall will present a good platform for all the G20 participants to engage robustly to find solutions to global challenges.
On today's episode of the Next Africa podcast, we'll look at what's at stake at this G20 summit and what chance, if any, South Africa has to try and achieve any of the goals of this year's presidency. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Joining us this week in Johannesburg is Bloomberg senior reporter Antony Sguazzin, who is going to be covering the G20 summit very closely. Antony, thanks so much for joining us and coming back on the podcast. Talk to us about what South Africa went into this summit and taking over the presidency with the intention to do. What was Ramaphosa's plan before we saw the unfolding of the relationship between the U.S. And South Africa?
Well, I think that Ramaphosa would have been very pleased that South Africa got to host the G20 summits this year because it gives him a chance to showcase the concerns and aims of the so-called Global South. So that means the reshaping of international financial institutions, which means provision of more finance for development and especially for climate adaptation, because there's been a long-standing gripe of countries like South Africa that the IMF and World Bank are too cautious in their lending. In addition to that, I think he was hoping to bring up the concerns of the wider African continent, especially in terms of debt relief. Post the pandemic, much of the continent has been in deep debt, and a few countries have been in debt distress and even default. And the G20, or the big economies' approach to this has been seen as cumbersome and overly bureaucratic and moving too slowly. So all of these would have been on the table, and really also just to showcase South Africa. He's trying to kickstart the economy, and the world's eyes would have been on South Africa this year, and they still will be, but there's going to be some controversy now.
Yeah, and we've seen that really unfolding over the past few days and weeks. Let's talk about the U.S. now refusing to at least take part in the first summit, the first few summits. How big of a blow is that for President Ramaphosa?
It's a huge blow. They're not refusing to take part in the summits, but what they are doing is it's a major snub. They are sending their charge d'affaires, which is effectively a civil servant in South Africa, to attend the foreign ministers summit this week, which means that nothing much can really be accomplished as far as the US is concerned. So it's a major concern because the G20 is a meeting of the world's biggest economies. And if the world's biggest economy is not taking part, how much can you really achieve? I think they'll be putting a brave face on this and trying to get as much done as possible, but it's going to be difficult, and no doubt it is a bit of a blow to South Africa.
And at the same time, we're seeing other partners then step up. We heard the EU Foreign Affairs chief saying that multilateralism is under threat. Based on the sources that you're speaking with, is this affecting the mood going into this summit?
Yes, well, I think it reflects what's going on in the wider world. If we look at what's happening with the Trump administration and President Trump's comments on Europe, their defense spending, on how he plans to handle the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and threats of tariffs, especially on his allies, including the EU. What it has done, I think, is it's brought the EU and South Africa closer together. Now, that relationship is very important. The EU frequently trots out figures that show that it's the biggest investor in South Africa. Goes head-to-head with China collectively in terms of total trade, But many of the factories and foreign companies that own assets in South Africa are based in Europe, and they employ a lot of people. So there's been a rather fractious relationship for the last few years. That's mainly been spurred by South Africa's rather ambiguous approach toward the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because it hasn't really condemned Russia's invasion. But now we're seeing an EU-South Africa summit, which has been long delayed, scheduled for early next month. We've seen the comments by Kaja Kallas, the High Representative of the European Union, a top foreign affairs official.
You can count on European Union's full support to South Africa's leadership and ambitious G20 agenda. I'm also convinced that both South Africa as well as European Union not only have an interest of working closely together, but will equally benefit from each other.
And there seems to be an attempt to patch up differences and to stand together against the opposition that we're seeing from the Trump administration towards both South Africa and the EU. At the same time, South Africa is a member of the BRICS group of large emerging market economies. And when Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, said he would not be coming to the South African summit this week, China was the first to express its support for South Africa's goals. And I think it will deepen the ties within BRICS and between South Africa and China, and perhaps also South Africa and India. India and China are big trade partners as well for South Africa, especially China, but it does give them an opportunity to cement those ties and build on them, strengthening the BRICS grouping at the expense of the G20.
Yeah, and we've heard from at least U.S. President Trump talking about the BRICS, even in his first few days, I believe, even before he took office. That will be interesting to see how that develops. Anthony, stick with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about potentially what could still be achieved. And as you mentioned, this is an opportunity for South Africa, what role they could play on the world stage as they host this G20. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today on the podcast, we're discussing the G20 presidency being held by South Africa amid a time of global turmoil. Bloomberg senior reporter Antony Sguazzin is still with us. So, Antony, earlier we talked about what South Africa was hoping to achieve before the Trump administration had started targeting a bit. What is definitively on the agenda, though, over the next few days?
I think it's very early. It's the first summit of the G20 year. But I think what South Africa will be looking to do is to get its aims in front of its partners within the G20. A lot of those revolve around global financial institutions. And I think given that South Africa and the EU are probably a lot closer aligned on their concerns over climate change than the US, especially under the current administration, there may be something to achieve. European countries have already contributed a lot towards South Africa's energy transition in terms of soft loans and grants to help the country transition away from coal. And I think there will be an openness toward discussing, putting pressure on global financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, IFC, on providing more money to help African and other emerging market countries or developing nations buffer their infrastructure and economies against the impacts of climate change, which South Africa rightly argues that hasn't been caused by developing countries, given that they have very little industry of their own and therefore produce not very much in terms of emissions. So that'll be one thing. I think they'll also try and get the debt issue on the agenda and generally pushing for discussions on giving the global South, which is not just the big countries like India, China, and to a lesser extent South Africa, but all of the global South, a greater voice in global institutions ranging from the UN to, again, the World Bank.
And we've seen President Trump, at least initially in the first few weeks, retreating from a lot of multilateral institutions. The future of the U.S. in the G20 is up for debate. Can the G20, though, make some progress on a lot of these issues that you're talking about without the U.S. at the table?
I think they can. I think that they will regard it as a shame that the U.S., the world's biggest economy, is not with them. But given that they aren't aligned on climate issues and on trade and on globalism, I think in some ways it might make the conversations a bit more easy because they don't have the one party that's dragging its feet. But at the end of the day, there's only so much you can achieve when a large chunk of the world economy is not participating in your talks.
And finally, Antony, when we think about the time that it is here, the fraught time, I guess it is, that South Africa is facing right now with the economy. We saw the budget getting postponed. What's your expectation for the role that South Africa can play in international diplomacy, given a lot of the domestic issues that the country is facing?
Well, I think that in some ways, the domestic issues are helpful for South Africa because the fact that it has a coalition government, it's having to accept a broad array of views, as we saw yesterday with the budget being postponed because the African National Congress's governing partners, the DA, and some of the smaller parties did not agree with a plan to hike value-added taxes. It shows that it's functioning as a democracy. And I mean, it's very similar to a lot of the European countries that we'll be dealing with. Germany has a coalition and so do many other European nations. So I don't think it's necessarily a negative. And generally, if you look at the forecast, the South African economy is on upward track. Nothing spectacular, but it is on the mend. And the right reforms are very slowly being put in place. So it's an upswing. I definitely think South Africa could have done without the turbulence that Trump's comments about its land reform policies and its international diplomacy, they certainly aren't helpful. And it's not helpful that Marco Rubio and other US officials won't be attending the G20 meetings, but nevertheless, there is room for something to be achieved.
And you can read all of our coverage of the G20 across Bloomberg platforms now. Here's some of the other stories we've been following across the region this week. South African Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana proposed a shock consumption tax increase to help rein in government debt. But the move was rejected by other parties in the nation's coalition government and derailed the unveiling of the budget for the first time ever in the country's history. Godongwana will release a revised budget in 3 weeks. A VAT increase would have been the first since 2018 and wasn't anticipated by any economists surveyed by Bloomberg earlier this month. And Rwanda-backed rebels in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo have advanced southward, reaching Burundi's border and bringing the Central African region to the brink of war, according to the United Nations. Rwanda has been impervious to widespread demands for a ceasefire, and the M23 offensive has raised concerns about the country's ultimate goal. Rwanda invaded Congo twice in the 90s to overthrow its government. And you can follow these stories across Bloomberg, including the next Africa newsletter. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley. Don't forget to follow and review the show wherever you usually get your podcasts. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thank you for listening.